Hello, once again. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Marshall Sanders returning once again for a new installment video on the new series that I have, which is called White Matrix, and how that affects the United States of America and the people, more importantly, of the United States of America. I would like to begin today's video with a quote that more aptly describes the systematic aspect of the white matrix. Let me read this quote to you, please. Now, and please listen closely to this quote. It says, "We have, as far as possible, closed every avenue by which light may enter the slave's mind. If we could extinguish the capacity to see the light, our work would be complete. They would then be on the level with the beast of the field, and we should be safe." That is a quote by a U.S. Senator by the name of Henry Berry, I should say, in 1832. Now, my question to you out there, for those who are actually watching this video, is when did that mindset change in the U.S. Senate? I want you to think about that for a moment. If you could perhaps give me a year, a date, uh, a decision, uh, show me that every member of these senators were rooted out, that their ideologies were rooted out, and show me when that process occurred or when those individuals who were not with this mindset replaced also with those without with the same mindset. Show me when they were not replaced with the same ones. And I think you all understand where I'm going with this. These things were never changed. So, in this installment, what I wanted to speak about was how this, some would call systematic racism, is really just a continuation of that 1832 mindset and stated intent, and how it prevails even today. So that when you are a person of color and you think perhaps the White House, putting the right person in the White House, perhaps putting the right senator, perhaps putting the right House representative, perhaps putting the right member of whatever government institution, mayor, governor, etc., is going to actively increase the possibility of blacks receiving rights and representation in this country. Well, obviously, you're going to run into a vast amount of systematic roadblocks, such as Mr. Henry Berry aptly admitted to in 1832. So, I know people like to think that this is ancient history, but as a man of color, even though again I associate not with the black race because I am multiracial, and again I'll say, as I said many other times, I'm very proud of all of my races. I'm not proud of all the things that all of our races did, but at the same time, I would not be here if it were not for the events that happened in the past. I can I can condemn the events of the past while also acknowledging the fruits of that labor being a net negative and giving me the opportunity to live in this life. It's just how I personally view it. I look at it as simply a gift of God. And if anyone who has a Christian evaluation, they probably have heard this evaluation that The devil meant it for bad, but God meant it for good. That is how I view things. That is how I continue to view things. That is how I could look past the anger and the bitterness and such other things, and yet acknowledge the reasons why a person should be angry, while not telling people that they should express that with a wrath that causes more problems instead of fix or provide a solution to those problems. So first here, let's continue to identify the things that have happened in more recent events that, and systematically speaking, that have caused blacks or people of color in this country, more specifically, because we know that others, minorities, hippies, uh, people who've come from other countries like Syria, uh, refugees. Down the line, we know that they are also having policies that negatively affect them unfairly, and certainly in comparison to many others that come into this country. However, again, we're specifically addressing the black point of view, if you want to call that, the colored people point of view in this country. Now, we spoke a little bit in the last video about the policies of Ronald Reagan, um, but I really kind of goofed that one up. Reagan was one of the guys that took it to another level, certainly. But it really came under President Nixon, who created the so many different departments to kind of focus on this war on drugs. That uh, again, it was Nixon that laid the foundation, the false foundation, which was even disproved before and during and after he stated this false war on drugs. But the point was, even to his own words, he literally said this. Um, well, his aide, Nixon's top aide, let me be clear. Nixon's top aide discussed the conversation he had with the president concerning this so-called war on drugs. And what Nixon has said was, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it, very, very close to the actual quote was, well, we have to find a way to get rid of the blacks and the hippies from being able to vote. Now, his position at that point was he wants to get rid of all opposition against those who hated his policy towards the Vietnam War. Now, understand that this war was actually murdering a people who had never at any point attacked the United States of America. It was all a CIA prop in order for globalists to take more property into institution and institute world banks for profit. So the old term of follow the money aptly applies to this situation. It was a money grab at the expense of countless lives, a big hit to our economy and finances and machinery and so many other things, that it was a net negative to the American people, black, white, otherwise. So Nixon was certainly just a continuation of, uh, excuse me there, Nixon was a continuation of policies that had been into this country, and even before the institution of this country was even called a country by Western standards. Now, so we move forward from Nixon into Reagan into Bill Clinton into Bush Sr., Bush Jr., um, Obama, and now into Trump. So we know of so many policies that they continue to use to destroy the black community. We know about how Clinton used the three strikes and you're out, which namely put people of color in jail the most smallest of matter. I mean, you looked at in the black population that was inside, that was how incarcerated over a year time, and sometimes less, of course, but over a year time, the kind of time that affects your job status, your voting status, and such other things that could be considered a felony. Um, that blacks were put in jail for things as simple-minded, or things that which they were accused of falsely, mostly, not even minorly, mostly accused of with no evidence, but thrown in jail for things such as vagrancy, loitering, having a small amount of weed, perhaps enough, was it a dime, or I'm not familiar with too much of the weed thing because I've never I tried it once, but it just I knew it wasn't for me, so I just left it alone several years ago. And but I digress. But for even small things like that, think personal consumption use of a narcotic, and what that did was it put a lot of it, and this also included the hippies. Also, again, I'm trying to define a more black perspective and not without trying to alienate the discussions that we should also have for those on how hippies or the so-called hippies were also targeted. But again, so the blacks were incarcerated, and then these blacks who were incarcerated, it put a felony and other things uh, on their box, if you will. What that did, and what that does even to today, it destroys hundreds. Listen to this. The projected amount of people who are in America, people of color, I mean they'll be called black, not including other minorities, is roughly around 48 million. Let's call it 50 million, right? So let's say 50 million. This policy, however, has personally directly destroyed the lives of hundreds of millions of black people throughout the times, throughout the centuries. So that what I mean by that is, if you had 50 years ago, you had another say 30 million people of color. Let's say that it was more, whatever. It affected half or more of those people of color, and both directly and indirectly, but mostly directly, because what that did was, let's say you want to affect the mindset or the representation in the Senate. Now, most of us are aware that most people don't come out of nowhere to run for senator or representative or even president. I mean, we saw anomalies like a Barack Obama, who came out of nowhere seemingly to become president of the United States. But if you can think of any major leader, they didn't just come out of obscurity. They went through steps. They were county council at a local level, or community activists, and then went to mayor, governor. They stepped themselves throughout the process. Now, what this policy against blacks has done, and these policies, this the systematic white matrix, in which I dub it, it has put into the situation that blacks are incapable of being able to put anyone that is a really good, fair representation of the reflection of those people. Uh, let's give you an example. Let's say you were in, say, Thomasville, Georgia. or some other place, right? And let's say that 60% of the people there are people of color. And I don't know this. I'm just saying, let's make up something scenario. Let's say 60% of the people are 60% of people there are people of color, and 40% are white. Now, uh, if all the whites basically voted for the person who wanted to keep their policies, and I want you to understand something. The things that you see on television with Martin Luther King and such other things, these were less than 55 years ago. That means the person who is um, born in 1960 is roughly 60 years old. They were actively, many, I'm not saying all, of course, there were many whites there that were actively against the black race. This is only 60 years ago. Do you really think that 60-year-old people today, or 70-year-olds, or 80-year-olds, do you really think those who were active, and again, we're talking about those who are active, do you really think that they have suddenly become not racist? But I digress again. Let's go back again to that Thomasville thing. So let's say 40%. Let's say the town has 100,000 residents. So 40% would be 40,000 white residents. And those 40,000 all vote for a particular, let's call it a racist person. Not saying it is, but just as an example. Please follow me. They vote for the guy that's going to keep the policy of uh, a white Thomasville basically having fair representation while keeping blacks suppressed. Now, so in order to do so, for their 40% out, gain that 60%, they're going to have to use some tactics to make sure that 60% doesn't show up. Now, when you consider that, if you're looking at it from an American aspect, let's say 33% of those 60,000 blacks were unable to actually show up, okay, because they're incarcerated. And so even when they come out of the jail, they say, well, I want to vote for my particular person that's going to make it better. Now, again, there are a great mass amount of people in jail, in prison, incarcerated, who never committed that crime, or or were given extremely harsh penalties for the smallest matter. Okay, now so now we just took around 20,000 votes from being able to vote. So now it's an even thing. It's 40,000 to 40,000 in terms of those who want to vote. Now we got, but hey, that's just equal, right? So now we got to make that even more distinct. How about introducing policies that will keep the black community more separated? How about you put more abortion clinics and liquor stores inside the black community's part of Thomasville, right? And so now it's like anything, right? You put a baby near a fire, the baby's going to want to touch it, you know. And so what happens is people are incited, especially through a depressed state. I guess what? Um, I'm a 16-year-old man, young boy, a teenager. I want to become a doctor, but my dad is incarcerated for vagrancy or some other kind of thing. He's now spending 3 years in jail, and I have to stand up and become a man at 16 years old and support my household. What do you think is going to happen to a 16-year-old? Forget what race they are, especially when you have a person, and again, I'm not putting it as all white people kind of thing, but let's be frank. Generally speaking, the smallest possible amount that's possible of blacks own any kind of thing that can make a difference in terms of bringing drugs and gun manufacturers, such other things that cause the harm. and liquor, makers and sustainers. The smallest amount of people of color have these institutions. So where's this stuff coming from? And why is it coming exclusively uh, from the greatest mass amount into our black communities? The liquor store is right next to the church. Whereas you go into predominantly white neighborhoods, it's not so. Because so again, you going back to the Thomasville thing. So now with so much angst, frustration, historical anger, and PTSD from slavery, from redlining, from being lynched under the uh, Willie Lynch laws, from Jim Crow to the new Jim Crow, to so many things that are destroying the black people, the black family, such other things. What do you think any person, any race, would do at that point? You think they would self-medicate to some ways and means? Do you think that the person who feels so unempowered would join a gang of people who feel empowered in gangs? I think so, and I know so. So to go back to the Thomasville thing, even though you have the majority in numbers in terms of its actual voting power and ability for fair representation and to change the culture, to change the representation from the local to the major level, that is constantly being removed by the minority in some ways over the majority that can do it. And by this means, in this example, the minority would have been the whites and the majority would have been blacks. And so you must understand from that standpoint, I'm talking about this framework for what is called black communities. So if you're still looking into these so-called black communities, you'll recognize that these black communities seem to always get worse or remain the same in crime and depression rate and abortion rates, in anything that appears to be violent and messed up. That is what you're going to see. And why? Are the people getting fair representation? Well, it's kind of hard to when the people who would be the ones who make the decision, who are in a position to best make the best decisions, are incarcerated and thrown in jail. This is a part of the white matrix that I think we really need to concentrate more on. Finally, I'll give this as a final example so that people understand how drastically horrible this is. John Boehner was once the head of the Congress. Okay. And John Boehner, like pretty much every hypocrite, liar, generally, generally racist um, person that inhabits our government. And they're more tyrants than they are racist. They don't care for whites, blacks, anyone else. They just have a larger affinity against blacks, but not exclusive. Most certainly, we're all, as Americans, victims of these tyrants. Understand that. But I digress. John Boehner is a guy who, of course, was the head of Congress, as its leader. John Boehner sat and watched as tens of millions of black people were thrown in jail, um, had their rights taken away, rightly and wrongly. There are guilty black people, sure. Okay. There were innocent black people that were thrown in jail, sure. But the sentencing, which is something I didn't even really get into, may have been so extreme for something so small that they could make it a felony whether the person of color was black. I mean, was guilty of the crime, actual crime, or not. It certainly was not meant for a deterrent or meant to say, "Hey, you have a drug problem. Let's put you in the Betty Ford clinic." That's something that generally white people do and have the privilege of being able to do. Blacks get a stick upside the head and thrown in jail. Now, so John Boehner goes, well, you know what? We got to keep up this war on drugs. We have to, be tough on crime and such other things. And under Clinton and so many others, many people of color went to jail under the three strikes and you're out rule, and they're going to spend the rest of their life. Listen to this. For many of you who do not know, they're going to spend the rest of their lives in jail behind bars when perhaps their main offense was smoking weed or having a certain amount of weed that the government could call a felony, whether in truth or not in truth. But generally speaking, they could call it a felony just because, just because. Okay. Now, John Boehner, you don't want to know what John Boehner did once he retired? Oh, you're going to love this. You're going to love this. John Boehner actually had marijuana use legalized. Yeah. 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 Oh, but that's not it. Come on. You think that was the story? That's not the story. John Boehner is actually now the lead promoter and making millions of dollars on the sale and distribution of marijuana. Come on, man. I'm gonna repeat that so you understand it. This guy who made policies to throw people of color predominantly in jail to ruin their families, to ruin their lives, to ruin their potential job abilities, to ruin everything in their lives that can possibly ruin, then becomes a drug dealer himself, making millions of dollars legally. And as if that could not possibly get worse, those young men and women who are sitting in jail, caged like we said from the beginning, what did it Henry say in 1832? We shall make them like beasts of the fields. Well, many of those black people are in jail, and they're basically considered no more than beasts of the fields. And rather than say, hey, you know what? Our policies back then certainly affected the people of color and unfairly and unjustly. And for those who are in jail for that, let's just stop this war on drugs that way on the people and just go like do this. Let's take out of jail those who are in jail for these drug offenses, which we now know was bogus and a setup to destroy the black race. Let's just get them out of there. They don't deserve to be there. Maybe in a treatment center, but they certainly don't deserve to be in prison for the rest of their life. And you know what? You notice that they keep the people of color in jail. Think about that. So, This is my Friday, I should say, video on the white matrix and how it systematically has been a problem to the black people. One of the biggest things of reparation that people are forgetting is the reparation of repairing the lives that were destroyed. Money aside from this, here is what I would say to those who say that blacks do not deserve representation, those who do not, that blacks do not deserve reparations, and that blacks do not deserve equality and justice. Let's go with the first one. Who wants to not be represented? Number two, who being victimized would not want reparations or would not sue? And that comes to financial gain when they've been victimized or have something stolen. Who? And I can say this conclusively that if you don't want people of color to get what they so richly deserve, which they so richly are owed. Let me give you an option. How about instead of giving one dime to people of color in America, how about you let out the millions of people of color out of the jail, give them a clean record and the ability to vote with a job. How about that? Does that frighten you when I say that? I mean, honestly, I want your honest assessment of yourself. It's not about being right or wrong, because if you're wrong, we can fix being wrong. What we can't fix is a person who's unwilling to even hear or even examine whether they are wrong or not. You can't fix that. So I'm asking you all an honest question. Would you like to see that? Would you think that's fair justice? That people who were victimized, who were often either innocent of the crime they were convicted of, or the the punishment vastly exceeded what it should have. Would you like to see those millions back into the community with a job, with a clean record, the ability to go to the bank and get a loan, driving down your streets, come walking in your homes? What do you think about that? Because if your thought is, well, I would not like to see that because, well, these people can be criminals, you can be this. Well, what do you think they think of you? Well, these people did not protect me when I was thrown in jail. These people did not stand up for me when they took my rights away from me. These people call me a criminal when I've committed no crime. So there are two perspectives on these situations, and I'm just trying to bring to you a perspective perhaps that you've never heard of. And I would like to ask you to examine your own hearts and to think about this and whether it is actually something that you yourself suffer from. Again, today's Friday. I wanted to get this video out as a Friday message. To me, as a Christian, this is the beginning of the nighttime of it. Today is the beginning of Shabbat. Shabbat meaning seventh, and Shalom, being, of course, peace or Shalom Shalom, which is a kind of, godly peace. And so, to those who celebrated Shabbat Shalom, to all of you out there, I wish all of you peace. Not just peace in your finances or some other little platonic thing, or some peace in, not fighting your neighbor or your friends, or Black Lives Matter, or, protest, or cops, or not just that peace. I want you to have peace in your mind and in your soul and in your wills. Having actual peace because you know what you're standing for is actually true, and what you're standing for is actually effective in removing the barriers of chains and yokes that are put onto people in this world. So, again, to all of you, shalom, shalom. I pray all of you have a wonderful weekend. And I pray that you all, again, consider all the things that I spoke about in this video. With that, I will make my next video soon, where we'll talk more in depth on the policies that need to be repealed and how those policies, time permitting of course, how those policies would affect not only the Black community and people, but affect positively affect white America and the U.S. government. Until then, shalom.